right. Hello and welcome, everybody. This is the start of a new series that Todd has dubbed Full Frontal Transparency. I am Dean Harris. I am one of the members of TeamEvilGSP. With me today, I have the evil genius himself, Mr. Broderick Chavez, and of course, I have Dr. Todd Lee. So what this series is going to be about is we're going to start where a lot of things start in our world, and that's bodybuilding and powerlifting. But we're going to go very far from that. And the idea of this is to talk about training in each of those sports and also the drug protocol you might want to use along with it. The reason we're going to start with bodybuilding and powerlifting is, well, they're kind of simple. They have a very simple goal: get as big and as lean as possible or get as strong as possible. And a lot of you have heard the drug protocols that go with those sports. Now, a lot of you might play other sports or be a multi-sport athlete, and you want to know maybe what drugs you'd use if you were a 100-meter sprinter or if you were a sumo wrestler. And we thought that it would be good to talk about all aspects of the sports world. So first, I'd like my two co-hosts to talk to me about, so people have a full background before you are where you are now, right? As bodybuilding, and Broderick was powerlifting and bodybuilding for a long time. Did you ever have an other athletic background? And I think this is important because it kind of sets the scene for how you got to where you are now. A lot of people don't enter the door right into bodybuilding or powerlifting. They do other athletics first, and a lot of times they don't carry those over or they don't think about those as they move forward. So give me that background. Todd, you go first.
Todd, by all means. I never was really into sports. I did do martial arts stuff. So I started judo when I was 5. Then I did like Shotokan. I did Kempo in high school. I did Taekwondo in college. I also did Jeet Kune Do and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu.
Okay. So lots of martial arts, lots of mobility-based things before bodybuilding. How about you, Broderick?
I'm going to take my answer a little bit further than Todd did, but it's because it's necessary for the story. As far as my physical being and athletics, the only thing that ever inspired me or interested me was barbell sports. Full stop. That was the thing I discovered. It was the light that went off. There was nothing else. 2, coincidence or not, I don't have, as the saying goes, an athletic bone in my body. I am the slowest human being to ever grace this planet. I have vast aerobic capacity, but I am heinously, almost comedically slow. So the idea of me being able to play a sport's laughable. The slowest sport in the world is 5 times faster than I can move. So, no. However, when I said I'm going to take the story one step further, my real transition from bodybuilding to powerlifting was kind of a slow march, and it was really that kind of classic, like, ooh, I should take a couple years to just get bigger, and that really just led to the, like, I actually enjoy powerlifting and strength sports more, plus the influences that were around me. But where I'm really going with this is the transition of my coaching, which I didn't even realize was happening at the time, but my coaching acumen went from barbell sports, which I had taken up from age 10, to university, which was very, very track and field heavy. And so I was transitioning these barbell techniques, both with the literal barbell and with the training strategies, periodization, etc., and then running face first, pun intended, into track and field concepts, which made both of our worlds, those athletes and mine, change, intertwine, conflict, and that's where my real coaching acumen developed, was actually working with track and field athletes.
Yeah, and that's an interesting transition. And for anybody wondering, we are going to have a lot of track and field later in this series. So I think those are interesting answers. And one of the things I always like to ask that is to see what people give me as an answer, because it kind of gives a definition of what they think a sport is. And that's where I want to go next as part of this introduction is, what is sport? Now, I would argue, I think Broderick would agree with me, bodybuilding is not a sport. It is much, much closer to the definition of a pageant. The lifting is not part of the sport or the pageant. The actual competition involves you posing, looking good for the judges. So that's where I want to go next is how do we define sport? I think that's very important. What's a pageant? What's a hobby? What's a sport? Is darts a sport? I don't know. Is pool a sport? I don't know. But there's people who take it really fucking serious and they will, I guarantee you, tell you to the ends of the earth that they're an athlete in that sport. So again, let's go back to you, Todd. What do you consider a sport for the people out
So I think I'm going to pull a Supreme Court justice and say, I don't know what a woman is. I'm not a biologist. So I'm not going to go on record saying what is or isn't a sport because I have nothing to gain and everything to lose.
there?
But I will say that I will say that I agree that if you disregard the lifting of the weights of bodybuilding, then the day of the show, it is a pageant. I would say it's more difficult than just standing in heels and twirling in a circle. And unless someone actually posed on stage in a bodybuilding show, they don't realize how physical it is.
Mhm.
But I will say that the way it is judged would be more similar to a pageant than gymnastics, for example, which is a judged sport, but is clearly the epitome of all sports.
Broderick, how about you?
Fair. I more or less agree with what Todd said, but I take a different take. I have a definition, and I know it's not Webster's definition, but I'm a word guy, so I'm going to state my definition, and then anytime there's a reference to sport, it shall be, at least from me, predicated on this definition. To me, a sport is anything with metrics, any human endeavor that involves metrics. There are weights on the bar, seconds on a clock, ducks in the air. There's an analytical thing in which you can measure, and that is why I do not count bodybuilding as a sport. Because you could make the same argument that like, well, the 100 meters, 100 meter sprinters really that's the least they do. Most of what they do is high bar squats and low long distance running, and that's accurate. So in a way, bodybuilding is not different in that what you do in the off season is not the competition, but there's no legitimate metric. At the end of it, it is an opinion. I love bodybuilding, I love it dearly, but at the end of the day, it is an opinion. You may think that Madonna of the Rocks is Da Vinci's greatest piece, and I may think it's Lady in Your Mind. Those are opinions. That's my definition. There must be a measurable analytical thing involved. How many pins did you knock down with the ball? How fast did you throw the ball? How many strokes did it take you to get to the hole?
So I'm going to push back a little bit on this. So in bodybuilding, the way it's judged is based on shots. So you get a point for winning a shot. And so if, let's say you've got Nick Walker versus Good Vito, and Nick Walker wins 5 of the shots and Good Vito wins 3 of the shots, then Nick Walker won. Shots are the metric.
I totally get your point, but that would be like you and I walking through the Smithsonian, going like, how many, which ones did you like the best? And it's still at the end of it, it's an opinion.
So then,
I don't, and believe me, that is not a besmirch of bodybuilding because I suspect if I put my mind to it, there are other things I love that are equally subjective. Hell, the floor exercise in gymnastics is literally one of my favorite things in the universe. It might also fall in that category.
That was what I was going to say, was that there's no metrics in gymnastics.
10 people can watch it and get ice skating the same. 10 people can watch it and get 10 different answers. So my definition is that I default to the Arthur Jones engineering concept. If you can't measure it, don't talk about it. I really believe that that's just a really, really good way to live one's life. You know what I mean? Like, don't talk with authority. If you can't measure it, it's not real yet. So that's my definition. Loads of people will disagree with me. I'm cool with that. I've made it this far without being popular. I'll get on the rest of it.
Now, and what I find interesting about Broderick's definition is that by that definition, a lot of things other people might not consider sports are brought in. By that definition, chess is a sport, billiards is a sport, darts is a
Billiards,
sport,
poker.
okay? And not saying that they're not sports, not saying that they are sports, but certainly there's people who would probably, a lot of bodybuilders would say bodybuilding's harder than chess. Now, that's what I want to get at next. I don't want anybody out there to conflate difficulty with athleticism. And that's something that I want to talk about now. And I want to talk about, people are going to see this as we go. You're going to see, as we talk about different
Or
sports.
danger, by the way. Also, I would put danger in that category. Bodybuilding can literally be life-threatening. No one's ever risked their life to bowl. But so I totally accept that there are avenues here.
And that's something I want people to understand. We're going to talk about sports that are far more athletic than bodybuilding, but they're certainly not more difficult, right? And again, we could argue about what the definition of difficult is, but we'll save that for another time. Now, the thing I want to get to next before we go down that road anymore is sort of a macro level, and something I want people to understand is one of the most difficult things for athletes to get, and I think this happens a lot with people in not just barbell sports, but every sport. Someone gets into a sport, they take it seriously, they want to get infinitely good immediately. They want to be the best they can possibly be, and they don't understand the timeline involved. The other thing they don't understand is that you can never be progressively amazing at every aspect of the sport all at once. So you can never get infinitely lean and infinitely big at the same time in bodybuilding. Just like in golf, you cannot hit the ball infinitely far while being infinitely accurate, right? So, Todd, let's talk about that topic. And just because we're reining this in for people, you know, I'm sure you've seen this, and maybe you fell into it yourself. What do you have advice for people out there, like reining that in, trying to be patient and also understanding you can't be good at everything all at once?
I run into those two things daily. It's a nightmare. It's a very hard thing to deal with as a coach, is putting up with this shit where people are extremely impatient and have unrealistic expectations about the speed at which you can accumulate muscle or lose fat, and how all these people can't grasp the fact that you can't go up and down on an elevator at the same time. So when I say to them, I'm like, can you go up and down on an elevator at the same time? They're like, no. I'm like, then how the fuck are you going to go up and down on a scale at the same time? And they're like, okay. And the same thing is, you might put on 30 pounds of muscle in 10 years. You're not going to put on 30 pounds in a week. You see all these dipshits putting that in their titles of their videos, gain 30 pounds in a week, because dumb motherfuckers will click on it. And so they're putting whatever they want in the title to get clicks. It doesn't make it fucking true. It's like when we're talking about dry stage weight, putting 3 pounds a year is a huge deal. And putting on 30 pounds of stage weight in 10 years is extremely rare. And the reason why you're going to quote me Nick Walker, all these people, is because that's what you've seen as these exceptions. But Nick Walker is actually the rule. Like, he gained 100 pounds in like 12 years from like 180 to 280 or something like that. That's 100 pounds in like 12 years. That's 100 pounds in 12 years. It's like 8 pounds a year. That's extremely good, but it's also extremely consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another perfect example of that is look at Ron Coleman from his never mind that kind of a languishing period pre-Olympia where obviously things weren't clicking, but from his first Olympia to his last Olympia, you can essentially look up his changes of body weight. You're talking about somebody with the most elite genetics, the most elite coaching, the most elite lifestyle, like just unlimited funding. Just name your thing. He had every advantage, and he didn't do the 30 pounds, thing. So come on, that stuff's just silly.
And I think, again, taking it outside of bodybuilding, if you look at any sport across the board, it is extremely rare to see someone in any sport have a very fast meteoric rise. It is absolutely the exception. People tend to see athletes at their peak because that's when they're. Randy Johnson was the best pitcher in the MLB for a long time. He wasn't there always. So for those of you out there listening, I think that's something to remember as we go through all of this. You should be in love with the progress, because the end goal might never come. And if you ask almost any athlete at the top or anyone at the middle who wants to be in the top, there probably is an end goal in mind, and then it always changes. So if you don't love the progress, you won't make it. Broderick, go ahead.
Again, going back to the bodybuilding and is it or isn't it a sport? To a small degree, I was kind of conditioned by people around me that had a big influence on me that bodybuilding wasn't a sport simply because of the way they, and I don't know the right word, so I'll use this one, the way they wore it. They literally identified as a bodybuilder in that they suntanned and they stayed lean and they prepped their meals and they probably took steroids and they did bodybuilding things, but many of them literally either didn't compete or didn't even consider competing. Competing wasn't a concept that was absolutely contiguous with bodybuilding. Bodybuilding was the creation and maintenance of one's mental ideal of physique. I can think of a bunch of really good physiques in the 90s that either competed fucking phenomenally rarely or zero. Victor Richards jumps to mind.
Richards, yeah.
Rory Liedermeyer. Rory Liedermeyer might be not might be. I rescind that. In my view, Rory Liedermeyer is one of the top 5 best bodybuilders who ever lived. I don't know if the guy competed 5 fucking times. So I definitely agree with where you're going in that. It sounds like douchey and cliche and like internet meme-ish, but it was way before there was an internet. Like, you should do the thing because you love it. Then
Yeah.
hopefully you will get good enough to pursue it, competitively or financially or whatever. But to lift weights, monitor one's diet, and improve one's physique doesn't require sport. It requires care for those things.
So I think that's the confabulation, is the people that identify as bodybuilders aren't. That, like, having one of these or having an NPC card, now you're a card carrying bodybuilder. If you don't have the card, you're not. And that's kind of like the example I always give, and this is a very unpopular example, is that laying on your back and having dudes pump cum into you doesn't make you a mother. Carrying a baby for 9 months, delivering a live baby, and then taking care of the little fucker for 18 years, that makes you a mother. So it's like just shooting steroids, lifting weights, banging chicks at the gym, that does not make you a bodybuilder. Actually dieting for 6 months, getting on stage, posing, and beating at least one person, that makes you a bodybuilder.
I can accept that approach. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but I totally grasp your position.
Right. And so there's just two different camps. One is bodybuilders are the lifestyle, then competitive bodybuilders are
Right.
people compete. But I'm on the other side of the fence. So to me, we're the bodybuilders. They identify as bodybuilders.
And I would accept that argument. I mean, that's the beauty. Again, this is why I don't spend a lot of time doing podcasts. It's because people want an argument where there isn't one. Like, I see nothing to argue there other than in my childhood, in my developmental years, that was viewed the other way around. And
right.
I have been conditioned to do so. And I'm comfortable with that. To me, the Barbarian Brothers were bodybuilders.
Right. And
to ridiculous ones, but they were bodybuilders. That's okay. Meanwhile, in my mind, I'll shit on everyone's favorite just because it's fun, and I mean it. I thought Frank Zane was a buffoon. I barely thought Frank Zane was a bodybuilder because he was a school teacher fucking 8 months a year, didn't bother to take drugs, didn't lift weights, and then he kind of just whipped himself into shape and did the little pretty thing on stage and ran off and hid. And to me, I thought he was a fucking goofball. And in the greatest of greats, he certainly rates higher than most of my heroes, certainly above me. So obviously, I'm wrong, but cool. I'm okay with that.
I think that if people were to compare the outliers of the Barbarian Brothers to the outlier in the other direction of Frank Zane, and they were to see them having lunch with their normal street clothes on, 99% of people would identify the Barbarian Brothers as bodybuilders. And in my book, that's incorrect, but it's correct. And then they would identify them, and they'd see Frank Zane with his wife and his kids looking like a very intellectual person who's physically fit, and say, that's a very healthy looking white collar dude.
Yeah.
They wouldn't say that's a bodybuilder. And again, by my definition, that's incorrect, but let's face it, that's correct. So there's always outliers.
Of course,
and
but it's just
there's always
to some degree,
outliers.
we're just illustrating the ridiculousness of of arguing the topic. Like
Right.
it's to some degree, it's just ridiculous. I mean, again, I grew up in an era. I hate to keep referencing my age, but I grew up in an era when bench specialists were not powerlifters. And now that's not even a conversation now. But like Bill Kazmaier, people were like, why don't you just settle down on that squat deadlift thing and just shoot for that 700-pound bench press? And the look of like insult and disdain, like, oh, what do you mean? Like what I'm not a wheelchair athlete. Like he was really indignant. But yet he could have done that. He could have been the first man to bench 700 had he not been pulling 900-pound deadlifts in his spare time. Like he totally could have done that. So shit changes over time, and the perspectives and mindsets that go with it change as well. It's cool.
So I'll give you a story that's similar to what you're saying. I had an ex-girlfriend who said she only dated bodybuilders. It turns out she had never dated a bodybuilder. She didn't even know what bodybuilding was, because her definition of bodybuilding is more of the colloquial definition, is dudes who are jacked and take steroids, and not guys who compete on stage. And
Fair enough.
There's the whole thing about legs and back that a lot of the juiced up gym rats don't have, that isn't readily apparent to the mainstream public. So like if they saw these bodybuilders in trunks on stage, they'd be like, wow, 3/4 of their body's underdeveloped. All I notice is the shoulders, the arms, and the chest, and maybe a six-pack if they're lucky. Yeah. But once they lose all the fat, they don't have back, they don't have legs. So 75% of their body's underdeveloped. So that's why it depends on your point of view. Where are you?
Short division?
Well, that was also the case with a lot of these individuals. She was confabulating men's physique and non-competitive men's physique with bodybuilding. So that's where that's part of why it depends on where you are on the fence. If you're the guy that works out harder and is more diligent and does more nutrition stuff and looks better than the competitive bodybuilders in your neighborhood, then you think you're the real bodybuilder and they're just schlubs who get on stage looking fat. Whereas on the other hand, if you are the competitive bodybuilder, the people who call themselves bodybuilders, it's disrespectful because they're not doing what it takes to win. They're just doing what it takes to look pretty in the best lighting, under the best conditions, in the mirror, in their bathroom. And so they're missing 75% of their body because you only see from the waist up and the front in the mirror. That's why I like the title Full Frontal Transparency, is that if you had a full-length mirror, then you would actually see what you really look like. But no one ever looks at themselves in a full-length mirror. They just look at themselves in a waist-up mirror.
Well, and
I'm at the stage where I do the opposite. For whatever reason, my orthopedic train wreck is such that I still have quads and glutes and hamstrings. My waist is probably as big around as my chest now because of overdeveloped abs. So I pretty much just do the opposite. I'm just like, yeah, the quads are still good. I'm good.
I do have to say, in person, Broderick, you look so fucking muscular. It was a shock. Not that you know what I mean? Like when you see people in person, they're always bigger, but with you, you actually look denser, like way denser in person.
I appreciate that, but yeah, I mean, again, like to me, yeah, like you do. I'm literally approaching my 54th birthday. I have been weight training since age 10. Like, if you can't get some shit done in 40 years, it ain't for you. So I totally take the compliment, but in the same breath, like, come on, like, you know what I mean? I'm coming up on double retirement for fuck's sake.
So just to jump in here, just to kind of continue the argument to one step to the side, because with bodybuilding, I think this is why there can be such a debate, because there's no official objective metric. It's who's a bodybuilder, who's not. Now, Broderick might agree with me here. I was a competitive powerlifter forever. And in my mind, you can lift all the weights you want ever in a gym. You are not a powerlifter till you get on that platform and those judges give you red lights or white lights. And I think that, going back to our previous argument, it makes that dividing line for sports easier. You are not a powerlifter until you stepped on that platform. Until then, you're just a person doing squats. They might not be to depth. I don't give a fuck if you said you squat 1,000 pounds. Show me white lights, right? Now, one step further, because I know people are going to have this thought as we move into this series is, well, I don't belong to one sport. And that doesn't mean they're a bodybuilder who powerlifts or whatever the fuck they think. They do soccer and they do running. They do bodybuilding, or they want to, and they do golf, right? And it's one thing I want to touch on is multi-sport athletes. It's difficult enough, and the higher you want to get in those sports becomes more and more difficult. And there comes a time where there's an absolute divide.
And conflicting.
Correct. Right. Now, even if you choose adjacent sports, right? And I'm not talking the 100-meter and the 200-meter. I'm talking, let's say, soccer and cross country. Okay. They both require tons of cardio, but they have a different goal. Now, if you choose conflicting sports like powerlifting and golf, that was my dumbass choice, there's a much sooner dividing line. And it becomes a hard choice you have to make is where are you going to go? Because you can't go, just like you can't be infinitely good at everything in your sport all at once, you can't be infinitely good at all sports all at once. So, Todd, I don't know if you ever had this happen where you were doing martial arts and bodybuilding. For some reason, I know that's a big thing now. People want to go from bodybuilding to jiu-jitsu like it's some sort of natural transition. But did you ever have this happen, and how did you handle it?
So it was powerlifting. So I did powerlifting before bodybuilding. I forgot that earlier because I think you specifically said other than bodybuilding and powerlifting. So, but it's like with powerlifting, I stuck into doing the barbell movements way too fucking long. Like I stayed with those barbell movements since I was in my 40s. And so then I ended up with a bigger waist, smaller arms, and smaller thighs. Whereas if I had given up on deadlifts and given up on barbell back squat and given up on even incline bench press and just switched to like leg curls for hamstrings and chest supported T-bar rows for back and dumbbell presses for chest, I would have had a much better physique much sooner and probably had a smaller waist in the process. But I wouldn't have been strong. So when I could still be strong, it was important to me to be strong. But once I started getting weaker and hurt, that regardless of how hard I trained, instead of my strength getting better, it was getting worse. I was like, all right, I pretty much have to accept that my days of being strong are over, but I can still be a bodybuilder. And so I stopped power building and started just bodybuilding. And my body looks better, but I'm not as strong. And I didn't think I'd ever be okay with that, but I am kind of. I was reconciling it in that first Dave Tate interview. Me and Dave Tate talked about it on Table Talk. That first episode, I had buried it, but I hadn't really gotten it out. Right. And then in that interview, because Dave's such a good interviewer, I actually was like in therapy in front of a camera and I kind of like let go of it. And since that interview, January, February of 2024, then I've been over it. And now I'm just able to just let go of all types of strength. Everything sets to 12. And that's the thing is, if you stick to the barbell movements, you will not have the best physique. It was not going to happen. Same thing with jiu-jitsu and bodybuilding. If you're really training to failure, you will suck at rolling. You're basically just playing chess with your body because you'll have little girls beating you and stuff because you will have no muscular strength or endurance.
Yeah.
It's all techniques.
One of the very first things I picked up from other coaches in track and field, when I say other coaches, I'm really shitting on the story. I was not even a coach. I was just an interested fucking interloper. They were the coaches, but I was, fucking in the gym
Interloper.
endlessly, and I was also, the guy with the access to the drugs. So, the two worlds met. But where I'm going with this is there was language like there is of bodybuilding. There's the bro talk of bodybuilding is cut and bulk, and there was also a lingo, a language of track and field. And one of them was an attempt to repeat some of the Russian or Eastern European axioms. And one of those axioms, which is exactly, Todd, what you're saying, but in different words. And that is, if it runs like a wolf, if it hunts like a wolf, in the end, it probably looks like a wolf. And apparently that was like a mantra within Russian coaching, that as if as you developed along your sport, if you weren't morphing into the ideal archetype of that sport, you were going to fucking fail. And so exactly what you said, Joe Sullivan spent his entire life as a world-class powerlifter. His first go at bodybuilding, as magnificent as it was for a first go, he had to be section of a powerlifter because he spent a lifetime building it. And it's going to take a very long time and a lot of soul searching to fix that. Can he? Maybe. Cool. I can't wait to see. But it's just a perfect example of that. It's like I said earlier in this conversation, like, you mentioned that I'm a little bigger in person than I appear. Yeah, I also have a 40-inch waistline. I have visible abs, but I have a 40-inch waistline. Because to not die with 800 pounds on your back, you must have a 40-inch waistline. So again, if it runs like a wolf, if it hunts like a wolf, motherfucker, it's gonna look like a wolf.
Yeah.
I personally, as both an athlete such as I was and a biologist, to me that's beautiful. To me, that's literally the beauty of Darwinian nature playing out as it's supposed to. To me, that's elegant.
Right. And what's funny is I didn't actually get a bigger waist when I switched from 400-pound squats to 500-pound squats, but the legs didn't really get any bigger.
100%.
And like the waist didn't get any smaller either.
100%.
And when I gave up on squatting and I switched to more direct leg training, like hack squatting and whatnot, my waist came in maybe a half an inch and my legs grew like an inch. So had I never crossed the line from a 300-pound squat to a 400-pound squat, and certainly never squat from 400 pounds to 500 pounds, had I stuck to like really high reps and high volume with 300-pound barbell squat, things may not have went as bad as they did. But why the fuck would you do the wrong exercise at all? It's like nowadays, everyone's so much smarter. They just hack squat. They just leg press. Nobody's barbell back squatting at all. And it's just too bad that it took until 2020 for people to change.
Now, having said that,
when we get down the road and actually talk training, I'd love to come back to that and have some debate, because I have essentially I agree with you, but I do have a couple of caveats that I would point out. But point taken, and I agree at large.
Well, let's just remove the quality that simply doing the exercise with less axial loading would not have an impetus for increasing waist diameter, and that the higher reps would be more volume. So even if you got the same amount of quad stimulation and the same amount of glute stimulation, you're having less waist stimulation by using less weight, higher reps.
100%. I would point out that, like somebody like the kind of the original godfathers of modern leg development, Tom Platz, Tim Belknap. Right. You just name the first people with like, oh my God, what the fuck is that? Weirdly, they were not doing 800-pound squats. They were doing 404 sets of 20, 30, 40.
They were
They
staying
were doing very high reps.
they were staying away from the higher loads. Not that 30 or 40 is better hypertrophy than 10, but if you were doing 10, you'd have to use so much weight.
Correct.
The ratio of waist
It
to
was
leg is so big.
It was load management. 100%. It
And,
was, I mean, I've had these conversations with Tom. It literally was
right.
load management. It's like, my legs are so big, like, I don't want to squat 800 pounds. So I do this. Like
Or
that,
leg extensions first,
right.
pre-exhaust with
Yeah.
leg extensions, which
Yeah.
Tom did. He would do leg
Yeah.
extensions first, then he would do squats, then he would do leg extensions again, and the next week he would do hack squats, but he would do
Correct.
the sissy squats with the hack squat machine,
Correct.
so that he could use the least amount of weight possible.
And then at the end of his career, I think he literally only trained legs once a month, once every 2 weeks at most, which is a whole separate conversation. But yeah, I very much agree with you on that. I think that taking bodybuilding and powerlifting as sort of adjacent sports is almost laughable because most of the things that bodybuilders take for powerlifters are just dead useless to them. Uh, and maybe not the other way. I think there's a lot of things powerlifters could take from bodybuilders, like cardio, dieting, range of motion. Like, I think there's lots of stuff that powerlifters can gain from bodybuilders, but I think there's almost nothing bodybuilders can gain from powerlifters.
Mobility, prehab, rehab.
I would argue that the biggest thing bodybuilders need from powerlifters is mental toughness. You can.
100%.
There's a lot of bodybuilders who want to deem that they're tough, and you're not tough until you've stood under 800 pounds and said, "I'm either going to stand this up or I'm going to end up on the fucking floor."
Yes.
All right. So, in regards to grinding out like reps under heavy loads and not being afraid of feeling your bones crunching and your wrist separating and whatnot, yes, but to me, what really takes toughness in bodybuilding is not eating when you're on prep.
Sure.
Like at the end of prep for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're hungry, you're tired, you still have to go to the gym, you still have to train, you still have to 2-hour workouts, and you've got 2 hours of cardio, and you have to not get in arguments with your boss or your wife or your kids. I mean, that's what, and then on top of that, they're heavily abusing drugs that make you angrier and not getting any sleep because they're using tren. It's this recipe for disaster.
And tanning and posing practice. And
yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, that's why I said in the beginning, like, don't misconstrue that I'm besmirching bodybuilding, but slightly. It's an enormous undertaking beyond the comprehension of anyone who hasn't physically done it.
But I would agree, Dean, that like benching 400 pounds and feeling your wrists starting to disintegrate, no matter how tight those wrist straps are, is terrifying and painful. And to grind it out, especially if you've got a bench shirt on while it's digging into your triceps, like that's something most bodybuilders don't deal with. So when I let go of powerlifting and just stuck to bodybuilding, the lifting part is fucking easy. So when I interact with Gen Pop people who think they want to be a bodybuilder and they can't take a simple set to failure of 10, I'm like, this shit isn't even fucking heavy. It's 70% of your 1 rep max. What the fuck do you mean you can't take it to failure?
Right.
You know, like that blows my mind. And I never considered that maybe my limit on what hardcore is high because of powerlifting, and so bodybuilding is relatively easy in the gym.
Or is it the other way around? And again, this is nurture over nature. Or is it because you're wired the way you're wired, you gravitated toward powerlifting, and that just kind of illustrated where the bar was? I think about these things. I think about these things endlessly. I don't know which is which.
And this is stuff.
It's a funny story that.
This is stuff I want to get into more when we just go to the next episode, because this is all fantastic. But I think this is what people really show, like the training one, training the other, drugs for one, drugs for the other. I before we get too far down this road, and similarly, I mean, I definitely sympathize with both of you because, as Broderick knows, I was a power lifter forever. Like Broderick, I had an 800-pound squat. And when I first transitioned away from competitive powerlifting, because my back said no more, when I focused more on hypertrophy, I did the same thing you did, Todd. I mean, I was squatting 600 for sets of 6, and my legs were getting no bigger. And I was like, well, that was cool. Why are my legs any bigger? And there's a transition period where you're like, why isn't this working? And I think, we just had this whole discussion about two sports that an outsider might say, well, they're adjacent. Well, as we just showed, and we'll show again in the next episode, when you dig into it, they're not that adjacent, really, right? The deeper you go, they're not that adjacent. And they also show that if you want to go as far as you can in both, they're not adjacent at all, right? You don't see people with 28-inch waist that have a phenomenal physique. They're not squatting 800 pounds, and vice versa. They got the 800-pound squat is not getting on stage. And you can just imagine the further apart sports get, the closer that dividing line becomes, right? I'll take myself as an example. I was a Division I level golfer, and I switched to powerlifting and very quickly realized, well, there goes my fucking golf game, right? Because they are completely on opposite ends. You need absolute stability for powerlifting. You need a lot of mobility for golf. And now I do both. But do I do both as well as I could if I only did one? Absolutely not, right? I'm willing to sacrifice because I'm not competing in them anymore, and I want to do both for fun. But I think that's something people need to realize is that at some point that seesaw has to tip, and you have to choose which side you want to be on. So,
but I would like to add this, and I apologize for talking over you, Dean. You are the host here, and I feel like I've exhausted a bit more oxygen from the room than I should have. But I do want to aggrandize bodybuilding in a way that I often don't. I usually seem very negative on it because. But I do think that, like in the hierarchy of fitness, I do think that cardiovascular fitness is the supreme variety. Without it, the creature dies. And all of the cellular cascades under it, from the electron transport system to creatine synthase to everything under it, is ultimately refreshed by that grand global Krebs cycle aerobic fitness. So thinking as a biologist, I think there's this global grandeur, and then everything under it is more niche. I think bodybuilding is the nutritional version of that. I think that bodybuilding has, to a pretty solid degree, particularly in the modern era of the kind of refined guru, whether you go to John Perillo or all the way to modern Chris Aceto, but the general concepts of lean foods, just appropriate amounts of green vegetables, low fat, easy to eat carbohydrates, lean proteins. Like, I think that bodybuilding has kind of perfected the human athletic diet at large. And I think that is a really fucking valuable thing that really ought to be acknowledged and exploited by so many other sports. If powerlifters ate like off-season bodybuilders, if sprinters ate like off-season bodybuilders, I sincerely believe those sports would get better. So
it's bodybuilders are the pioneer for the fundamentals that all other athletes have to learn, whether it's eating, hypertrophy training, fat loss, or cardio modalities. And then most importantly, like tracking health metrics. I don't know a single other athlete from any other sport who does any of that shit right. They basically have a coach that tells them, jump on this box 10 times, run this obstacle course, hit this pad, and then they just nod and smile and do it. Yeah. Whereas a bodybuilder has to, even if they don't have a coach, which most don't, they have to basically organize their entire fucking life from the minute they wake up to the minute they go to bed and miss nothing. Otherwise, they're not winning.
Yeah. And they're also, just real quick, they're also tracking metrics like blood pressure, blood glucose, skin fold millimeter, stuff that either other sports don't even think about or act like it's such a huge deal. For instance, not to shit on the guy, but to shit on the guy, every time you hear a strong man who's coached by Nathan Payton, they make a big deal that at World's Strongest Man, he comes and he checks their blood glucose and then tells them what to eat. Like, big fucking deal. It's a $15 meter on Amazon, and he looks at it and goes,
I know.
Like, it's something I have my clients do all the fucking time. It's not special.
And I hear that he has them eat donuts. I'm like, that's fucking retarded because a donut is 33 grams of sugar and 14 grams of fat. And people are impressed by this. Like, this is not impressive. This is retarded.
You can
I
have
see.
anybody.
I don't know. I don't know really of who you speak, so I can't say anything. But I'll take issue with Todd, with you on two very, very minor technicalities. One,
Okay.
bodybuilders, all those things you said, 100%. The place where they lack is neurology. Bodybuilders have very, very low, high threshold output. They have very, very low force production. So, like coming out of the blocks at 100 meters, throwing a shot put, like none of that. They literally go out of their way to not be good at that.
Yeah.
Right.
Admittedly on purpose, but important caveat. Because when we start talking about other sports, that's a real thing. Like
Yeah. Power.
yes,
There's
and then the
zero
other thing I would,
power.
as well there should be, as well there should be. And then the other thing I would say is what you said about most other sports not tracking, not doing whatever. Yes, until you get into the really, really fine upper layer where budgets are so big that they're paying people like me. There's many of me around the world, and then they're tracking those things ad infinitum.
Right. And
Literally 24-hour glucose monitoring, sleep tracking, body temperatures, like ludicrous levels of, lactate threshold tests, and like those exist. But you're right, they're literally the 1% of the 1%.
right. And there's just not that now. This past 2 years, 3 years, money has started pouring into bodybuilding, and we're gonna see this explosion of people doing stuff like the smart way, not the traditional way. And they're going to start including things like all the bodybuilders should be wearing that in the next 5 years.
Absolutely.
Every one of them is going to be using insulin, extremely less insulin, because they're going to not need it. They're going to be using retatrutide and berberine and 10-minute walks to manage.
DHB.
Yeah, they're to manage their stuff. And I think that now that there's a masteron shortage, if DHB is not an AI, DHB will have to be the go-to anabolic steroid. I just haven't mapped out how aromatase inhibiting it is. I think I'm probably going to start next week or in a week or two and start putting in DHB and see if it crushes my estrogen.
I can't wait to compare notebooks because I have a pretty significant notebook. It is really some fascinating shit. But well, thanks for entertaining me, gentlemen.
Pleasure is all mine. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you. Till next time.